Hi everyone, welcome to Bold Conjectures with Paras Chopra. Today I'm with Varun Deshpande, who's the Managing Director of Good Food Institute India. The Good Food Institute is an international non-profit that promotes plant-based meat, dairy and eggs, as well as cultivated meat as alternatives to conventional animal products. Varun started their India arm in 2017 with an aim to answer one question: how can we feed 10 billion people by 2050, a sixth of whom will be Indian? Through systems that do not negatively impact climate, biodiversity, and scarce natural resources. So, according to research, close to 80% Indians are protein deficient, and traditional answers to fixing the nutrition gap is more animal proteins, that is, more eggs, more milk, and more meat. However, livestock is a disaster when it comes to environmental impact and obviously causes needless animal suffering. So, question really is, can we do better than the base case? Varun definitely thinks so. Good Food Institute India is laser focused on enabling an ecosystem in India for alternatives to animal proteins. And in the process of doing so, fixing many of the world's urgent problems such as public health, malnutrition, food security, climate change, and animal welfare. So, welcome, Varun. Really glad to have you on this podcast.
Thank you so much, Paras. Glad to be here.
Right. So I wanted to first understand a little bit more about your career, Varun. What has been your journey? How did you end up ultimately starting the Indian arm of Good Food Institute?
Yeah, Paras. And to be clear, we're actually an international network of nonprofits. So we're not one organization. We function independently as independent organizations. So GFI India is its own organization. And then we have a network globally. There's GFI Israel, Brazil, Singapore, the US, Europe, etc. And we set strategy locally. So we do different things locally. And of course, in India, we're doing different things than our partner organization, GFI Israel, would do in Israel. And we can talk at length about all of those things, I'm sure. As far as my career is concerned, I've been insanely lucky insofar as, I grew up in Mumbai. My father's a cancer surgeon. So I've been kind of obsessed with healthcare my entire life. Been kind of in and out of hospitals, hanging out with him and his colleagues when he was, a young doctor all the way through to now. And just thinking about healthcare and particularly the delivery of healthcare and the justice of the delivery of healthcare. So health systems and how we can get healthcare to everyone, right? I studied in the US. I went to college at Carnegie Mellon University, but I guess the definition of studying here is pretty generous to me because I wasn't fantastically engaged. I was in chemical and biomedical engineering. I ended up dropping out of that degree, which, as you can imagine, for Indian parents and in an Indian milieu is not the most conventional choice and quite stressful for everyone, as you can imagine. And also very ironic because chemical engineering and biomedical engineering are very relevant to some of the things that I do now. But I immerse myself more in the healthcare ecosystem in the US and India, going back and forth. And then you get a sense of, from the healthcare ecosystem, it's a pretty easy jump to the idea of public health and how we get everyone the best healthcare that they can possibly get, which is an unsolved problem globally, right? And then when you think about those questions, you also start thinking about what are the most efficient ways, the most cost-efficient ways, the most high impact ways to solve some of these wicked problems that exist in the world, whether they're within the sphere of healthcare and global health. So they could be things like pandemics, they could be things like malaria, which is a huge source of death and suffering all over the world every year, of course, right? And then also other things that are looming on the horizon or here right now, like climate change, other areas like things like global poverty, extreme poverty, of course, a lot of which are very relevant to us here in India. And through all of this exploration over the course of a few years, I happened to come upon the same problem that you and I are discussing here today, right? Factory farming or large-scale industrial animal agriculture. It seems to be one of the central nodes that affects a lot of these different problems. So if we're talking about global health, global poverty, a lot of these issues related to climate change, public health risks like pandemics, zoonotic disease, etc., which we can discuss at length, it turns out that raising and slaughtering animals at a very large scale is a major problem that affects all of these things. And you also mentioned animal welfare and suffering. Of course, that's part of it as well, right? I didn't think I would ever work in this space, but then I discovered the Good Food Institute US and what was happening in the US, where companies like Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, and Eat Just were showing a way, demonstrating a model to actually tackle this problem. Because for decades, people have been saying, don't eat animals for a bunch of reasons. And again, we can get into those reasons. But unless you provide people with viable alternatives to make a switch, not a sacrifice, it's going to be very difficult to actually make a change, make a wholesale transformation in this global food system that we have as we have it right now. So I saw that, there's a lot happening globally. The theory of change here kind of hit me like a thunderbolt, which was, in hindsight, this should seem very obvious, right? Like, it's literally the theory of change is give people and producers products that taste the same or better and cost the same or less, and have a number of advantages in terms of the way they are produced for all of the factors we talked about earlier. And then they'll have the option to switch, which they've never had before in history. So, seeing what was happening globally, I kind of got into this space, and we can talk more about what GFI India does within this ecosystem.
Yeah. So one of the things that struck me was when people encounter some sort of injustice in the world, or some sort of situation that doesn't align with how they see a good world to be. I think the most obvious thing is to make a personal change. Some people go vegan, some people donate more, but you ended up starting an institute, a non-profit. And to me, it strikes like, and I think you're also involved with effective altruism movement, and love to talk about it later. But it seems to me you are out there for a leveraged impact, and not really what you can do in just your personal lifestyle changes. So did this kind of an approach come naturally to you of what is the biggest bang for the buck we can have? Because I see that's where you are going with Good Food Institute, having a massively leveraged impact, or was like you had some influences that made you think in this regard, in this way?
This is a super interesting question, Paras. Thank you for asking it. So I should preface everything by saying, when you asked me about my career, maybe I should have started much, much earlier than that. I think I made a very, very great decision very early in life, which is that I chose my parents extremely well, right? Like, and obviously nobody chooses their parents. The point that I mean, some people do, of course, but in my case, the point that I'm trying to make is that I was brought up in a position of privilege. When you're brought up in a position of privilege, you have opportunity to think about these things, right? I think someone was telling me recently, reminded me of a story that we read in the 9th standard called Dukh Ka Adhikar, the right to feel sadness or the right to feel pain. It usually, occurs to people that are in a position of privilege, right? Most people who are not in privilege don't have the ability or the inclination to think in terms of leverage, etc., because there's this there are a bunch of other burdens on them. So I should have prefaced everything by saying that I think that the idea of leverage and of having the highest impact that we can have with our lives certainly appeals to me on a personal level. And you mentioned the effective altruism movement. Earlier when I said I was examining some of these questions, I came upon this community of people globally called the Effective Altruism Movement, which seeks to examine these questions. So how can we reduce suffering the most, or how can we have the most impact in the world, given that we have limited time and resources, including money and talent, etc.? How can we direct those resources to the most important problems in the world and figure out the most impactful ways of tackling them? And this kind of approach, I think, is known in different terms across different sectors, right? So like very recently, you may remember the Nobel Prize for Economics last year was won by a couple of economists, one of whom is Indian, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. And they are famous for starting an organization called JPAL out of MIT, which basically brought the idea of measurement to the social sector in a big way, right? Like, so they basically said, let's run what are called randomized controlled trials, which is a concept that's very common in medicine and drug development and all of that. Let's bring that concept of measurement to social programs. Are we actually having an impact? What would happen if we did nothing? That's how you can get to a rational place in terms of deciding and doing what is known as triage, right? Directing resources to the most important problems in the most impactful ways. And it might sound, again, all of these things sound like very obvious ideas in hindsight, but at the time, these were very radical ideas to bring these things into these environments, right? So I think all of these things appeal to me on a personal level quite naturally. But I just want to underline, anyone to a great degree, not everyone obviously, but to a great degree, many of the people that are working on things that have leveraged impact or starting their own businesses or working on some of these problems do have a certain amount of privilege to begin with. So like I can't speak for your situation, but I grew up in Mumbai. We have the largest slum in Asia. India has 1/3 of the world's extreme poor, which means we're even punching above our weight in terms of, even if you account for our large population, which is about 1/6 of the world's population, we have 1/3 of the world's extreme poor, which means we have disproportionately a larger number of extreme poor. Similarly, people that suffer from malnutrition, etc. So you see all of these things around you. Obviously, a lot of us want to make a difference. Like I say, I got pretty lucky to get to the exact position where I am today.
Right. I think likewise, very well said. I think people in positions of privilege, only they can afford to think in terms of their just immediate circumstances. They can think long term, they can think of leverage. And that's where, but I find your journey curious in terms of trying to think and picking a cause that has not just a single implication, but multiplicative implications in terms of how it can make the world better. So with that said, Varun, wanted to come to basics. What are alternative proteins and why are they important?
Yeah, great question, Paras, and great segue as well, because we're talking about the cause area that impacts a lot of these other things, right? So the cause area that we're talking about, as I said earlier, is industrial animal agriculture or factory farming, right? So in terms of why finding an alternative to this system is super important, it's because, as we've talked about, it affects a huge number of problems in a bunch of other areas that we all care about, right? So if we're talking about, for instance, climate change, industrial animal agriculture is responsible for more climate change than all emissions from the entire transportation sector combined. So all planes, trains, cars, everything on Earth put together, it contributes more to climate change than all emissions from that sector combined, right? If we care about any of the following problems: deforestation, ocean dead zones, ocean acidification, greenhouse gases, biodiversity loss, pretty much anything, whether it's big or small, large or local, that affects environment and climate change, we should care about this problem. And people have been saying this for decades. The raising and slaughtering of animals is one of the top 2 or 3 most important reasons for the world's most pressing environmental and climate problems. That's not from me, that's from the UN. It's from the Eat Lancet Commission. It's from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's from the Food and Land Use Coalition. It's from all of these very important organizations that day in, day out, they study the problems of climate. So, I mean, why is all of this happening? It's pretty simple. We eat animals or fish, like seafood, and those animals need to eat plants or they need to eat other inputs, right? Which is a very inefficient system. So we have to use huge amounts of land, water, and energy, non-renewable energy, and emit huge amounts of greenhouse gases to feed those animals and then slaughter those animals for us as food. So if you take a chicken, which is the most efficient animal that's farmed on land for meat, it takes in 9 calories of input for every 1 calorie of output it gives you in the form of meat. And chickens, as I say, are the most efficient. So, pigs are worse, cows are much, much worse. Fish, depending on the fish, because we've started farming fish in these huge aquaculture operations as well, they are usually worse. And they have a bunch of other issues as well. So, we're actually getting pretty meager returns for our investment here. And we can't get much, much better than this. We're bumping up against biological limits with this system. We've actually bred these animals over many, many decades. We've got to this point after a very long time. And this is a very technology heavy industry, right? Like they've measured, like if you talk to some of the people that run some of these operations, even in a place like India, they'll tell you, we've gone from an average bird weight of about 2.4 kilograms to 3.4 kilograms, but the US is at 3.5 kilograms, et cetera, et cetera. I could be getting those numbers slightly off, but you get the point, right? So we've done a lot of work, we've input a lot of technology, and we're bumping up against biological limits here. Not only that, it's not just the problem of inefficiency and the climate change and et cetera, all of the problems that causes, right? It's also on the public health side, there is a huge amount of risks because we grow these animals in close proximity to each other. It creates a risk of what are known as zoonotic diseases. And this is a term that perhaps is very, very well known in this year or in the last couple of years more than any other because of everything that's going on, because the COVID-19 pandemic may have been a zoonotic pandemic. I think we're still waiting for the results of that. But the overall point is that, many of the pandemics over the last century, right, whether you look at bird flu, whether you look at African swine fever, of course, that's not jumped to humans. But if you look at swine flu generally, a lot of these epidemics or pandemic risks emanate from the way that we currently consume animals, right? And this is a huge problem. And there's another twin threat as well, because we need to feed these animals antibiotics to keep them healthy. So like a poor pig farmer in China doesn't necessarily care that he's contributing to antibiotic resistance per se, because he can't afford to care. All he knows is that when he feeds his pigs a mix of what is called growth promoter, or he feeds them antibiotics, which are very cheaply available over the counter, they don't get sick as often, and they in fact get fatter for whatever reason, right? So like 70% globally of all antibiotics are fed to farm animals and not humans. And this is a recipe for disaster. So the former head of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, said that this is basically creating a situation where we could get into a world where common infections will once again kill, which would be the end of modern medicine as we know it. And as we know, I think, a lot of people have studied this problem. Pioneering new antibiotics is billions upon billions of dollars of investment in drug development, etc. In order to keep the antibiotics we have working, we really shouldn't be feeding them willy-nilly to animals, right? I think sub-therapeutic use of any medication leads to resistance to that medication. That's a well-known fact everywhere around the world. So look, there's, I just said a bunch of stuff. There's all of these things, but as we discussed earlier, people have been saying these things for decades. All of the organizations I mentioned have been saying these things for decades. And in fact, it hasn't made a huge difference, right? People saying eat chickpeas, not chicken, eat chana, not chicken, or eat broccoli, not beef internationally has not made a huge difference. The world is eating more and more meat than ever before, right? And in fact, a lot of that growth in meat demand is going to come in places like India, places like China, places like eventually sub-Saharan Africa, where incomes are continuing to rise, right? So we need to find alternatives that make sense, that appeal to people, that meet them where they are, that satisfy that craving for the most part, right? Products that taste the same or better, and hopefully eventually cost the same or less as well. And that's where alternative proteins come in. Should I keep going?
I just wanted to build on what you were saying.
Yeah.
Your point that this contributes to significant greenhouse emissions, maybe perhaps larger than transportation industry. It just struck to me that we are electrifying pretty much everything, but we can't electrify cows, chickens, pigs, and eggs. So when scientists all over the world are recommending going to net zero emissions starting today, practically today, if we want to see humanity survive for a long time, then I think it is not a matter of choice then, right? We can have Teslas, which are electric vehicles, but if we keep eating beef, chicken, and pigs, and keep rearing cows for milk, then we'll never get to zero emissions.
Paras, you're 100% right. And a lot of the solutions that are proposed, which is like incrementally reduce the emissions from the industry, feed the cows algae, do a bunch of stuff like that, those are going to squeeze out incremental improvements, very small on the margin. And we can't afford it. Like this year and last year, we have seen literally pandemic refugees in this country, right? People who were stranded, the lowest socioeconomic groups that were stranded because they couldn't move, because transportation was suspended, and they were walking thousands of kilometers across state lines. Elderly, pregnant women, children. This is what we're facing in our country, right? And climate change is going to be exactly the same. The next pandemic is going to be exactly the same, right? So we cannot afford to be thinking in terms of incremental improvements. We need to be thinking in terms of a true paradigm shift. And you're exactly right. What you said, electrification of the transportation grid, as well as basically the transition of our energy supply into a basket of renewables, et cetera, et cetera. This is the third big pillar of climate change transformation. Basically figuring out what to do about our protein supply, our meat, egg, and dairy supply that people still want to eat, right? We're going to have a situation where in 2050, as you said, 1/6 of the world's population will still be in India. But what will have changed is that people will be demanding globally 50 to 70% more meat, right? And we need a paradigm shift here. We won't be able to, fulfill our goals. We won't be able to essentially adhere to our promises under these climate agreements, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., unless we think in terms of a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift, one of the opportunities here, one of the major opportunities comes in the form of alternative proteins. So maybe I can talk a little bit about those categories of alternative proteins and what they are.
Sure. Yeah. Would love to know more.
Yeah, thanks, Paras. So these basically alternative proteins are a transformative set of food innovations that allow us to kind of have our meat and eat it too, right? The idea is that we want to be able to create the same products that people know and love, that are embedded into heritage, that are embedded into culture, meat, eggs, and dairy, but made in a different way. rethink what it means to be these things, right? So some of these categories of innovation, they're called plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation-derived proteins. So plant-based proteins are things that you've already seen that are out there. Plant-based dairy is already well known. It's out there. You have your soy milk, almond milk, etc. You have plant-based eggs, which have come out, which are really interesting. Companies all over the world, including in India, are looking at making eggs from plant or crop ingredients. And then you have plant-based meats. And I should say that all of these plant-based foods, they can get a lot better, right? Especially in India. But the important thing to note is that what they're doing is they're going far beyond your previous generation of soya nuggets. The idea here with the plant-based meat is it's made from plant or crop ingredients, right? Like pea protein, soy protein, coconut oil, even beet juice, all of these things. But the use of food innovation has enabled us to basically recreate the meat experience, the sensory and cultural experience of meat, so that it feels like a simple switch, not a sacrifice. Whereas a meat eater in a previous generation would not have looked at a soya nugget and said, this is an adequate replacement for chicken. I want my chicken. Right? I want my curry, kebab, keema, biryani. I want all of those things, right? The advent of an advancement of food technology has allowed us to get to the point where we can actually produce products that get very close to what we know and love. And this is happening across plant-based meats. It's happening across plant-based eggs. There's a company out of San Francisco called Eat Just that I mentioned earlier that's pioneering plant-based eggs. Their primary input is mung bean protein. And as we know, mung beans have been grown on this subcontinent for over 4,000 years, right? So we should really be doing stuff like this. And the idea is they did a lot of research and they found that mung beans have a mix of components, amino acids, etc., which enable them to be used to create these scrambled plant-based eggs, which are fluffy, which have the taste of eggs, etc. And you can spice them up and do things the way you want. And they're selling all over the world. They're selling in the US, they're selling in Europe, Singapore, etc. Right? And now Indian companies are trying to do the same thing. And similarly in plant-based dairy, there's a lot of advancement. I think we don't want the next generation of plant-based dairy to taste like almond water, right? I think a lot of it is guilty of that right now, but there's a lot of advancement happening there. So that's the first big pillar, Paras, is this plant-based proteins. I'll be a little quicker on the other ones. There's fermentation-derived proteins as well. Fermentation, I think we've all heard of. If you've had kimchi or kombucha or beer, I think we all know what fermentation is all over the world, right? Fermentation occurs because of microorganisms, right? Like fungi or microalgae and things like that. And fermentation-derived proteins are using those microorganisms to produce protein in some way. So there's companies all over the world that are doing this. These microorganisms grow very, very quickly. They're very efficient. And they are, as I say, production platforms that have been used in other categories of food that have been existing for millennia, right? So we already know what they can do, and they're quite miraculous in that way. And then the third category is cultivated meat or cultivated proteins. And this is really interesting. It's almost like science fiction, right? We're talking about basically producing meat or even milk in some instances. Some companies are doing that by using the cells of the animal instead of raising and slaughtering the animal. So if I wanted to produce a chicken breast, I would take just a few cells from a chicken, and then the chicken can run off and do whatever it was doing before that, right? And then I can produce meat from that. And this does sound like a bit like science fiction, as I said, but it's not that different from what's happened in other industries. For example, in pharmaceuticals, we used to get components like insulin from animals because you couldn't really, for diabetics, you couldn't really get insulin, human insulin. We couldn't manufacture it until the 1980s. So we used to use huge numbers of pigs and ducks in order to get insulin. So we weren't even using human insulin. We were using pig insulin, which is kind of similar to human insulin. And it used to take 23,000 pounds by weight of pig pancreases, which is the organ that produces insulin, from 8,500 pigs to give you 1 pound of purified insulin. That's how inefficient it was, right? Like there were companies all over the world that could extract this insulin and then purify it. It was a hugely inefficient process until we figured out how to manufacture insulin in a clean manufacturing facility. And we got away with this. We did away with this crazy, inefficient, very, very unhygienic process of getting insulin from animals. So that's kind of what this is like, this transformation with cultivated meat. And there are companies all over the world that are doing this. So, at scale, you can imagine that a cultivated meat production facility would look like a large beer brewery. It would look like, instead of these hundreds of thousands of animals being raised and then slaughtered, or in some cases even more than that in some facilities in places like the US, you'd have this like large clean production facility in a way that we currently manufacture pharmaceuticals or things like beer, etc. So it's really, really fascinating stuff. And across all these categories, I think we could have hour-long conversations on each of these, to be honest with you. So yeah, I'd love to discuss more on any of them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find exciting about this is traditional animal-derived products. I think they're stuck. They're stuck where they were. You cannot change, say, how a cow milk is composed, what's the nutrition, what's the taste, so on and so forth. But what's exciting to me about alternative proteins is we can literally engineer them to be whatever we want them to be. And there's no reason to be aiming for just being at par. I think although that's an amazing first milestone, if you can recreate butter chicken without having any chicken in it. But to me, what's even more exciting is that whole space of food that opens up if you are able to engineer food from the scratch, and you're not just limited by what animals are producing because they can't change.
Yeah, Paras, that's a great point. I mean, I think what I want to say to that is that different countries and different civil societies and how different societies are set up around the world have different attitudes to what you're describing, right? And India is, of course, a country that has a specific attitude towards things like GM, etc. And what I'm describing is not GM. It doesn't have to be GM. I'm sure some companies around the world will use GM in the way that they're producing a lot of these products, but that wouldn't fly in India because we don't have, like, it's illegal to use GM in food, which might predict how the Indian population and legal apparatus will also react rather to engineering that could change the composition of foods that are well known, right? There are experiments all over the world of people trying to express beta carotene in a vegetable that wouldn't have otherwise given you beta carotene, which is carotene, of course, comes from carrots, right? If you now try and make Simla mirchi, capsicum express carotene in much higher quantities, how would the Indian ecosystem react to that? I think that's an open question. But let's go to what you said, parity. I think even parity is a far cry from what we have right now. We don't have parity, right? Because if you look globally, Paras, there have been studies done all over the world. In Canada, there have been studies done that showed that 60% of seafood that they studied was mislabeled. So you think you're eating a bluefin tuna, which is an exquisite fish that's hunted in the open Pacific Ocean, right? And it's like $5,000 per pound by weight because it's this like extremely, I mean, it's like a very high-end fish, but you're not getting that. You're getting something else because it's mislabeled, right? Like 60% of seafood is mislabeled. That's, most people are just not getting what they pay for. And I want to bring in the Indian angle here also. If you go to Dharavi, I mentioned growing up in Mumbai. If we go to Dharavi right now and we talk to a family of 4, they will tell us they're eating, let's say, 1 mutton meal a week for 460 rupees. And if they could, they would eat 2 mutton meals a week for 920 rupees, 3 mutton meals a week for 1,380 rupees. Now, that demand exists and it's going to grow, right? The only constraint is income. And why shouldn't it be? Because I'm not trying to put a moral slant on this. If people want to eat something that's tasty as heck, right, to them, that brings people together, that's a sign of aspiration, right? It's a sign of prestige and status as well. Then why don't we enable that in ways that we should enable parity, both in terms of nutritional outcomes, in terms of quality, in terms of access, but in ways that don't continue to break the planet. Right. So I don't want to settle for parity, but I think once we get there, then we can talk about all the other exciting things that can happen.
Yeah. No, I think it's totally fair not to expect people to, especially, I mean, from a position of privilege. I think when people, and I think there's a good parallels to what people think about who owns the responsibility for emissions reduction. So coming from Western countries who emit 20x, 30x per capita than India, expecting India not to catch up to their standards, I think that's totally unfair. And I guess you're making a very similar point, that people should aspire to having a better lifestyle. And as technologists, as engineers, it's our responsibility to make sure it happens without negative consequences for the planet.
Oh, yeah. I mean, 100%. And the point you made is a great one, right? I think this is pretty analogous to other areas where people are talking about emissions, they're talking about plastics use and all of that in countries like India. And I think a very fair retort to all of that is to say, look, Western countries as well as China have spent the last decades rapidly industrializing, right? In China, they have spent 35 years between 1978 and 2013, basically wholesale moving people into cities, rapidly urbanizing at a scale that has not been seen anywhere in history. I think I read that they were using more concrete in an average 3-year window than all the concrete that had ever been used in the world in history up until that point. Wow. Okay, that's insane. Sorry, all the concrete that have been used in the prior 100 years by the rest of the world, something like that, right? Like it's something cartoonishly large like that. And so why should regions like South Asia, regions like Sub-Saharan Africa not take the same path? Because currently we're not contributing that much at least on a per capita basis. Of course, when you then analyze on an aggregate level because of our large populations, etc., I don't think the world can afford us to take the same route that the West took. And we can't afford it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the impacts of what we're describing are local impacts. Niti Aayog says most of our major cities are going to run out of water by 2030. That's a huge problem, right? So like if we are building huge water guzzling industries and scaling them up over time in India, that's going to affect us most. We're going to run out of water earliest, right? And that's a huge problem. So I think what we have an obligation and an opportunity to do in this part of the world is consider the concept of leapfrogging. And you know this very well coming from the technology world. We went from no phones to smartphones to a certain degree, right? Like we skipped landlines in many parts of the country. In places like Sub-Saharan Africa, they went from cash to digital payments. They went from like being unbanked to digital banking. It's miraculous. I mean, some of the systems that have been set in place, like the M-Pesa protocol for cash transfer in Africa, is more advanced than you find in financial services in the US. It's less cumbersome, more secure, etc. Right? So like it's pretty amazing what can be done if we just rethink systems, but with, of course, the local constraints and the local challenges and the local opportunities in mind. And that's where the concept of leapfrogging over industrial animal agriculture to a better protein supply that is diversified, utilizes a lot of these other protein sources that still give us exactly what we want, but are vastly better for the planet. I mean, we're talking orders of magnitude better, right? So like if we're talking plant-based meats, Beyond Meat, which was the first company to really, really rethink all of this. In 2008, the founder of Beyond Meat, Ethan Brown, said, I'm working in renewable energy, but no one seems to be really looking at next generation food products that can tackle this food problem also. Whereas, animal meat contains fats, that is lipids, it contains proteins, amino acids, it contains minerals, it contains water, and all of that stuff you can get from plants. We just have to grab some of this research and do additional research to make those next generation products that taste the same or better. So he created this company, Beyond Meat, which today is public on the New York Stock Exchange. It went public in 2019 in the most successful IPO of any kind on the New York Stock Exchange in over a decade, right? And Americans eat 3 beef burgers a week on average, right? That's an indication.
That was a surprise for me when I read that.
I like America, but it's for all sorts of reasons, it's just crazy town, right? Like three beef burgers a week on average. That's the problem we're talking about here, right? Other countries have contributed so much to these problems globally. 3 beef burgers a week on average is horrendous. Like that's why if you take all the cows in the world and they form their own country, they'll be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world on the country list, right? And that's because of things like this, that Americans are eating 3 beef burgers a week on average, and that's what's contributing to it. But if you just replace one of those beef burgers with a Beyond Burger that's made from all plant ingredients and it's manufactured a completely different way, that is the equivalent of taking 12.2 million cars off the road or powering 2.3 million additional homes. And that's truly transformative change if we're able to scale that up. And for the consumer, it's just lunch. Right? If we're able to make it taste the same or better, it's just lunch. Like I'm not sacrificing anything. So I think that's how we need to think in a place like India. We have to go, of course, beyond the burger, not just beyond burgers, but going beyond the burger as well. Think in terms of, biryanis, kebabs, keemas, the things that we know and love, curries, etc. And we hopefully can create some diversification or leapfrog over this industry.
Yeah. So Varun, I want to follow up this with really understanding how's the progress been towards uptake of alternative proteins, excuse me, and what's holding us back? What are the barriers you see for even faster accelerated uptake of these alternative proteins?
Yeah, thanks, Para. So, we work across business, science, and policy as an organization, and you need all pieces in order to build something from scratch, build an industry from scratch, right? So on the business front, there's been some decent progress, I would say. There are several dozen companies, mostly on the plant-based side and fewer on the cultivated meat and the fermentation-derived protein side, But mostly on the plant-based side, there are several dozen companies that we're working with. Several of them are already launched, but not, the majority of them are not yet launched. They were formed within the last year or 18 months or 24 months, which is quite encouraging. There are companies out there that have launched plant-based meats. Of course, there's a number of plant-based dairy companies already launched, a couple of companies looking at plant-based eggs. And I would say we're still at the very beginning of this ecosystem building. The entrepreneurs are one piece of it, but there's beneath the surface, there's this huge, the rest of the iceberg, right? So there are a lot of corporate partners, a lot of university partners, a lot of infrastructure providers like labs and manufacturing facilities, a lot of people that we're working with. And when I say corporate partners, I mean ingredients, right? If you need pea protein for these products, where's that pea protein coming from, right? Who's producing the pea protein, who's extracting it, who's selling it to you? And you need, let's say you're making a product with chickpea. The chickpea flour is not going to be your standard besan that we've known for centuries in India, right? It's going to be a specialized, newer form of chickpea flour that is fit for use in a next generation plant-based dairy product, so that plant-based milk is creamy and it performs really well in a tea or in a coffee or in an curry, Indian desserts, right? Those kinds of things. So that's kind of what we're talking about, is these specialized next generation ingredients, all of this stuff. Now, on the university side, we need to create the next, we need to create lakhs upon lakhs of young talent, young people looking at this space. And by the way, as an aside, as anyone can guess, especially talking to you, Paras, from the technology world, as anyone can guess, all the companies around the world have Indian talent up and down the ranks, at the founder level, at the leadership level, at the line bench research level, at any level, right? So we need to basically also create that ecosystem of talent in India. So we're working to embed university level curriculum and courses, university level labs, so that people can basically practice with these machinery, these equipment. Lots of work with the government. We had some early success with, particularly with cultivated meat, really interestingly enough. Universities like the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad, along with the National Research Center on Meat, which does animal science research. We put them together, we co-wrote a proposal, and in 2019, we were able to secure a grant of about 4.6 crores to do cultivated meat research from the Department of Biotechnology of the Government of India. And at the time, the reason this is notable is at the time, this was the largest grant for cultivated meat by a government anywhere in the world. Okay. Which is really cool. We also have an agreement to set up a research center exclusively focused on cultivated meat and fermentation-derived proteins with Institute of Chemical Technology, Mumbai. Again, at the time, this was the first government-mandated research center for this anywhere in the world. And these projects will take their own time to evolve, right? So we think that we can create essentially consortia of research institutes. Huge amounts of interest already exists from young people and students in this space. And that comes in from food scientists, chemical engineers, biomedical engineers, marketing experts, all kinds of young people are super interested in the space. And then now, we've talked about what's already happened. In terms of barriers, I would say the biggest barrier, I think, is complacency. We could name a bunch of other barriers. I think the regulatory frameworks do need to come up to pace with some of the pace of innovation. So especially with things like cultivated meat and fermentation-derived proteins, they would fall under what's known as novel foods regulation. And we've had great, really positive interactions with the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, or FSSAI, which everyone knows what that is because it's on every packaged food product that we see. But I think there's work to do there, right? There's also, I think barriers in terms of the availability of talent and investment and all of those things. And that's where I think complacency is the biggest barrier. Look, we have 9 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and we need more of everything in all of, and I mean, even in renewable energy, right, in India, but I'm talking about our space. We need huge amounts of investment up and down the life cycle, whether we're talking about early stage entrepreneurs or, growth stage capital, or even huge like manufacturing facility type stuff where you have more mature investment capital coming in, debt, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of work that needs to be done across this sphere. So what can help? I think everyone getting involved. We work with entrepreneurs, large corporations, investors. We're even helping to get specialized funds set up purely for our space in India. So alternative protein incubator, alternative protein venture capital firm, etc. And then, government agencies, philanthropists, pretty much everyone needs to get involved. If you care about any of these problems, climate change, public health, food security, animal welfare. Let's work. Like that's what we need.
Varun, one of the key factors in making this all work is consumers, their acceptance of the products, alternative protein-based products.
Yeah.
And India being such culturally embedded, culturally rich country, are you optimistic that people will make a switch willingly? And what gives you optimism? Because if consumers refuse, say, alternative to dairy, then no amount of pushing will do the job, right?
100%. No, you're exactly right. And I think the wonderful thing here is that we can be optimistic on that front because consumers are telling us if we build it, they will come. In terms of consumers, particularly what is known as the early adopter cohort, that already exists in India. People who already are aware of what's happening internationally, who are aware of the impact of food on the planet, impact of meat, eggs, and dairy on the planet, right? And especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, people waking up to the idea that for their own health and for planetary health, they should be trying to at least substitute some portion of their consumption, if not all of their consumption. They might have seen a documentary like Game Changers or any of these other things, which can sometimes be quite alarmist, right? But there's a kernel of truth to what they're saying. But then, if I watch a documentary like that and I don't have a viable alternative, I might try and eat the chana not chicken for a few weeks and then I'll give up and I'll go back, right? So that cohort already exists. They are young, urban, upwardly mobile, usually double income, no kids type affluence. A nice proxy for it is, do they have a Spotify premium subscription or do they listen to the Paras Chopra podcast? So they're listening to us right now, every single one of them. No. So this group is like 30 to 50 million people across all the metros and tier 2 cities, right? And like I said, they have a Spotify premium subscription, right? That's probably what it is. Or they know about CureFit. They might go to that kind of gym. These are the kinds of proxies that we've seen work. So in that cohort, Paras, people are ready. If you give them a product that tastes like the Beyond Burger or that tastes, the equivalent for biryani or whatever, they will at least try it. 63% of that cohort is saying they would be very willing or extremely willing to regularly purchase plant-based meats instead of their regular meat consumption. And that's great. Now, the main question, and I think this is an open question, is can we go from the early adopter cohort, which is primed to try this stuff, to the true mass market? And that's a huge question in a country like India. Because like you said, ultimately we shouldn't expect people on the basis of morality to make these choices, right? I think we should be focusing on very, very simply, tastes the same or better and costs the same or less, and has all the same aspiration, etc., of meat consumption, right? Meat, eggs, and dairy consumption. And if we can get there, I think then we can go from where we are now, which is this early adopter, upper end of the market, people who are consuming like their global counterparts in Singapore, Sydney, London, etc., to the true mass market. And that's really what we have to focus on over the next decade.
Right. So the ultimate aim for alternative protein ecosystem should be to come out with a product which is just superior in all regards, right? Taste, convenience, accessibility, price, and morality and climate change will take care of by itself if this is achieved.
100%. And I should say, a lot of this, we started the conversation almost by saying a lot of people make changes that have to do with their personal consumption, but a significant portion of consumption is affected by what's going on in the world of business, what's going on in the world of the supply chain, right? And actually, there are significant advantages of switching to this for producers also in the supply chain. So, for example, if we're talking about things like, avian flu, which I think we've all heard about, has happened, multiple times over the last few years, even while the COVID pandemic has been going on. The people who suffer the most from avian flu are not, people like you and me who might not eat chicken for a couple of weeks or whatever, right? The people who suffer the most are the farmers who are farming those chickens because they have to immediately get rid of 4,000 chickens.
Yeah.
Right? Equally, African swine fever, Paras, is a hugely, hugely devastating thing that's happened in the country of China, wherein over 60% of their pigs have had to be culled or have died from this disease in the last 3 to 4 years. Okay. And 60% of the entire stock of animals in that country, of pigs in that country, has died from or had to be culled from African swine fever, which is just mind-bogglingly large. And that country is so dependent on pork as a industry that they jokingly call their consumer price index the China Pig Index, the CPI. Okay. And that has also, by the way, spread to pigs in Assam and all as well. It's not, we are not immune to those kinds of things, right? So I think in terms of supply chain resilience, a lot of these things, creating more resilient industries, in terms of farmer welfare, etc., there is an opportunity to diversify. Now, we're not saying, switch over entirely or stop doing what you're doing. We want to present an alternative, right? And I think that's where a lot of opportunity comes in to scale this up.
Right. So Varun, when you look back in 2017, when you're starting Good Food Institute India, and now and going forward also, how are you measuring the progress that's happening, and what is that North Star that you're really chasing?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. And this is metrics and impact are things that we are constantly revisiting. In terms, there are some obvious things, because so we work as it's like a weird organization. We work at the intersection of basically being a think tank plus an accelerator plus a expert partner / consulting type organization, etc. Right? So network builder, etc. We think of ourselves as a field builder from the ground up. We're building the field. In terms of impact, there are some obvious things we can think about. How many companies got started as a direct result of our intervention? Did our advisory guide the industry to move forward in a specific way, like better products to be launched? We have some more sophisticated things also. We're creating basically dashboards of like how much manufacturing capacity exists in the space, so that 5 years from now, you and me as entrepreneurs, or you as an entrepreneur, you shouldn't have to invest in your own manufacturing facility, right? Like that's a sign of an immature industry. If every entrepreneur has to start their own plant, ideally there should be co-manufacturing facilities, even product development partners everywhere available, right? So, making sure that the ecosystem is mature and all the indicators that go along with that, that's a huge part of our internal metrics of progress, right? In terms of North Star, again, I think the best North Star is to basically try and look at a world where alternative proteins are no longer alternative, but they're very much a part of the mainstream, right? We've moved ahead to essentially diversify the protein supply to have a huge participation from alternative protein. And that is going to take, when we say 2050, that is going to take that long, because we're talking about, decades-long transformations of trillions of dollars worth of industries. And that has to happen slowly, and it will happen slowly. And everyone has a stake in that future of food, right? All of these large corporations, everyone from smallholder farmers up through to cooperatives, through large corporations, will end up transforming themselves and responding to these consumer needs and et cetera in different ways. So I think, it's a mix of being very patient and long-term oriented, but also looking at what we can get accomplished in the short term. As far as, big open questions for us, which I think is relevant to discuss at this point, I do think that we can get much, much better in terms of perfectly replicating the taste of animal meat, eggs, and dairy. We can definitely get there.
Yeah. So Varun, since we are at the end of our sort of time, wanted to ask if any of the listeners are interested in working in this sector, especially if they're students or they're entrepreneurs, what advice would you have for them? And I know you've given lots of advice, but any specific advice you'd give to a student or an entrepreneur?
Yeah, great question. I think so. We're running a lot of programs that help to integrate talent into the space. We'd love to talk to you and work with you to get you integrated in the space. For example, last year we ran what's known as the Smart Protein Innovation Challenge, which we're running again this year, starting soon. People were sitting at home, students, entrepreneurs, etc., were sitting at home stuck. Students were telling us, we don't even mind going back to college and taking exams right now, but everything's closed, right? It was very depressing. So we basically created an open online course and challenge where people would come in and take 40 hours of learning materials, and then they would take quizzes, and then they would form teams and submit business plans, and some of them might form companies, but mostly it was to train the talent pool and get them very deeply educated in this area, both science and business of alternative proteins, or what we call smart proteins in India. Ultimately, instead of the couple of hundred people that I thought we would get, we got 1,085 people going through this thing. And I think this year we'll beat that, right? So that's coming up soon. My best advice would be go through the Smart Protein Innovation Challenge this year. But certainly the overarching piece of advice I would have is, there's a huge amount of information out there on this space. There's a huge amount of goodwill from people looking to network with you and help you get into the space. There's a positive energy to this space that I think is all pervasive, because I think everyone knows that what we're trying to accomplish here is genuinely very important to the future of this planet, and that we are at the beginning, the exciting beginning of this exciting, very, very long journey. And we need all the talent that we can get. So I think, as much as you can, reach out to us. You can write to us at india@gfi.org. You can link up with all of us on LinkedIn. We're very happy and open to chat. And I think participate and lean in fully. The opportunities are immense in this space, and you are needed in this space, is what I would say.
I can attest to what you're saying, Varun. You and the team have helped me clear up some of the doubts I've had and been very supportive. So I'd encourage anyone who's interested in this space to make use of any resource that GFI India offers. And the entire team is very supportive and open. And also, I wanted to mention that GFI India is a non-profit. So if the philanthropists are hearing this and you align with this cause, so feel free to donate or support GFI India. It's amazing the kind of effort the team is putting, all for free. So any way you can support Varun and the team, I think that'll be a good outcome for India. So with that said, Varun, thank you so much for your time today. It was love talking to you about, I know we could have gone for hours and hours, but this is an amazing introduction to alternative proteins in India. And I hope many of the listeners end up getting inspired and joining in the cause.
Paras, thank you so much. Thank you for what you just said as well. It's really touching for you to say that and for you to encourage people to support us. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you for having me on. And I just want to say to anyone who's listening, whether you're a skeptic, whether you're totally on board with this, whether you love the taste of meat, whether you love animals, care about the planet, etc. This space needs you, and it has a home for you. We'd love to have you, and we'd love to have you be consumers of these products also that are getting launched. Whatever you want, succulent, delicious kebabs and etc. We want to be able to give you what you need. So thank you so much, Paras, and thanks everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.